I've been using the POCO X3 Pro for almost a month now, and I have to say that it's an X3 NFC with a better gaming chipset. But that doesn't mean that you should buy it already. If you're new to the channel, thanks for joining me. I create videos about tech, but mostly about gadgets, and if you want to see more videos in the future, feel free to subscribe to the channel. Going back to the phone, the X3 Pro is not entirely replacing the X3 NFC. It's literally the bigger sibling with a more powerful chip thanks to the Snapdragon 860, but not without sacrificing one feature, and that feature is the camera. Unlike the X3 NFC, the X3 Pro is using a 48-megapixel Sony sensor instead of a 64-megapixel. The ultra-wide experience also gets a downgrade from 13-megapixel to 8-megapixel, but for the rest of the two sensors, you still get the same 2-megapixel macro in depth. Based on my tests, switching back to 48-megapixel isn't a huge deal. Yes, photos do appear slightly less detailed, but overall they are still on par with the X3 NFC, if not identical. However, the downgrade is a bigger deal to the ultra-wide lens, as the 8-megapixel is simply lacking in sharpness. In lower light, things get softer as expected, but with night mode, aside from the weird white balance, the X3 Pro can get bright and sharp. Videos, on the other hand, is pretty much no contest between it and the X3 NFC, regardless of ultra-wide or wide. But thanks to the more powerful chip inside the X3 Pro, it can push its 960 FPS slow-mo up to 1080p. Although lacking in sharpness, the slow-mo video is clean with no software trickery. For the macro lens, it's still a gimmick at this point, but you can get decent shots if you leave the flash turned on while capturing. If you want to see a side-by-side camera comparison of the X3 NFC and X3 Pro, including selfie test, I made a video on that which you can check on the pop-up link above. So for the cameras, there's a bit of a downgrade, but it's not a big loss for the asking price of this phone. The X3 Pro doesn't veer away from the unapologetic design of the X3 NFC. You still get the same huge strip, huge camera module, huge branding, and overall all-thick design. While I was not a fan of the X3 NFC, I am digging the looks of the X3 Pro mainly because of its new finish and color. You can get the X3 Pro in bronze, which looks a lot like pink in person, the standard blue, and this black model that literally reflects purple and bluish hue. This is still an all-plastic phone, but the side portions of the back are now sporting a frosted finish that makes it smooth to the hands without attracting fingerprint smudges. And based on how the light hits the logo, it appears as if the branding is lit up with LED. The fingerprint scanner is embedded onto the power button on the right side, and it sits flush with the frame, thus providing a smooth glide when getting a feel for it. You still have the IR blaster up top, as well as the headphone jack at the bottom. It's a standard DAC, still not as good as the ones found with laptops. One thing that POCO fixed on the X3 Pro is the vibrating back panel whenever the speaker is in use. You can still feel a bit of a rumble, but it's the normal vibration you get from a stereo speaker phone. However, the overall loudness and quality take a bit of a hit, but still enough to provide a decent listening experience. Also, the vibration motor is worst on this model. It's a bit loose compared to the subtle but tight motor of the X3 NFC. Now for display, it's using the same 6.67-inch Full HD Plus IPS LCD with support for 120Hz refresh rate. The screen switches between 60 and 120 depending on the content you're on, and you can still watch HDR certified videos. It's also bright enough to be used under sunlight, so not a lot has changed here. If I have to nitpick, there is some slight yellowish inconsistency on the bottom portion of the display, but that's typical on LCD phones and it didn't really bother me during my time with the phone. When it comes to the Snapdragon 860, the performance headroom didn't really make any noticeable effect on day-to-day tasks, maybe a little bit faster and responsive than the X3 NFC. The improvement is noticeable when playing graphics-intensive games though. If you're really pushing it, you can play Genshin Impact at low to medium settings with around 40 frames per second, but stutters are often present. I suggest sticking to 30 frames for a more stable experience. I also encountered no overheating during extended usage and charging. I do have the 6GB RAM model, and it's more than enough for what I need it to do for most usual tasks. Despite the extra headroom provided by the Snapdragon 860, it's still hobbled by Xiaomi skin. During my testing, I was mostly running on MIUI Global 12.0.4 stable version with March security update. And take note, this is Android 11 out of the box. POCO X3 Pro still comes with bloatware, but fortunately you can uninstall them. But the biggest problems that I had is the touch delay and slowdowns in certain parts of the UI. For the simplest task like scrolling through my notifs, I can see that it's not scrolling at 120Hz. And for some reason, when I'm using my YouTube app, the entire app slows down to the point as if everything is in slow motion. Now, I get that most of you will say that it's the display switching between 60 and 120, and I get that. But that's not the case with my experience. It's literally slowing down to like 10 frames per second, but worse. The best fix that I've done so far is to restart the phone. However, when I have YouTube playing in picture-in-picture mode, this is within the app, the problem still persists. As of this video, POCO has yet to send out an update. Some other bugs and quirks that I've noticed are MIUI 12's Android 11 lacking support for gestures on third-party launchers like Nova, nav buttons non-appearing after viewing a photo, late arrival of notifs, and the display dimming when using sunlight mode on for boosting brightness. Hopefully these bugs get fixed with software updates just like how they did with the X3 NFC. But for now, you may encounter some of them. You still get the same 5160 mAh battery, and because it's powering a more powerful chipset, the battery life is slightly worse but still excellent. I normally get 5 to almost 7 hours of screen time with a bit of gaming on the side. To sum up, the X3 Pro is still a great value phone, especially if you're looking to game on a budget. This can almost handle all games on the Play Store. But if you're coming from the X3 NFC, should you upgrade? Probably not unless you're really looking to game seriously. But even if that's the case, you have the Mi 10T, the POCO F3, and even the POCO X3 Pro with better chipsets. But if you're coming from a 2 or 3-year-old mid-range or budget device, the X3 Pro is a sweet upgrade that won't hurt your pocket. Speaking of pricing, in the Philippines the price of the X3 Pro is constantly changing. The 6GB 128 model comes with a suggested retail price of 12,990 pesos and 15,990 pesos for the 8GB 256 model. The base model is still affordable at that price point, but the top model is creeping in the category of the Snapdragon 865 powered Mi 10T and even the Snapdragon 870 powered POCO F3. But if you can wait for deals, the prices of the X3 Pro go down to 10,990 pesos and 13,990 pesos. At that point, the phone becomes an incredible purchase as a true budget gaming phone. That's it for my POCO X3 Pro review. Feel free to support the channel by leaving a like or comment or dropping a sub. And as always, until the next one, stay safe.